Good evening and welcome to Sunday Night Prime. And I'm delighted you're with us. I have an interesting subject and visitor this evening. And of course, so often I'm speaking about life, protecting life, supporting the work of God in bringing human life into the world. And I'd like to just do you a little bit of a reading first. People hear me speaking about life and maybe they got a little tired. In the 14th chapter of the Gospel of St. John, one of the most beautiful chapters in the whole Bible, Jesus said to the apostles, "I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. If you really knew me, you would know my Father as well. And from now on, you will know him and see him." And Jesus goes on later in the next chapter. "If the world hates you, keep in mind that it hated me at first. If you belong to the world, it would love you as its own. As it is, you do not belong to the world, but I have chosen you out of the world, and that is why the world hates you." Now, we're looking into the gigantic conflict in America, into the Western European countries, and much of the world, the conflict over human life, saving life. And we have a very special visitor tonight who is an obstetrician and gynecologist, an outstanding young physician, and I want you to meet him and listen to what he has to say. My friend, Dr. Damon Cudihy. Doctor, welcome, Doctor. Tell us a little bit now about your background.
Well, I grew up in Georgia, Marietta, Georgia, near Atlanta, and I was raised in the Catholic faith. My parents, introduced me to the faith, and I received, the sacraments of initiation, and was fortunate to go to a Catholic high school in Atlanta, and gave me a good, intellectual education and preparation for college. But it was, I think, really in college where I discovered my faith, as an adult. A wonderful campus ministry, the Brotherhood of Hope, who is still there doing great work.
In what college?
Florida State University.
Uh-huh.
And but I will say that some of the seeds for my vocation to the medical profession, were planted in high school when I was first made aware of the issue of abortion. And I'll never forget when I saw what it was, I was horrified. As a high school student, 9th or 10th grade, and I started doing some research, and I was appalled at what I found. A few years before, I was concerned about the environment, and that seemed to be a big concern of mine, that the waters were being polluted and trash was around landfills, and so as a young adolescent, I had concerns about justice and that, and then when I saw what was happening with regard to the unborn life, and that our country and our legal system had permitted this for many years, I was appalled.
You had looked at a book, I think.
Yes, and it was, I think, my mom had a pro-life brochure of some sort, and that kind of, struck something, and I remember reading into it a little further. And then when I came to college, I had that idealism of a college student wanting to make a difference, and the only place I saw any interest in standing up for life was in the Catholic faith, in the Catholic Church. There was no pro-life campus student group at the time. But within the Catholic Student Union, which it was then called, there was a Respect Life Committee. And so God really kind of brought me deeper into the church, precisely because of what a faithful witness the Catholic Church has been for life. and that was God worked through that to bring me closer to Him. And during my time in college, probably even more profound than my secular intellectual education was what I discovered about my faith and myself and a lot of these issues.
Dr. Kamen, where did you do your medical studies?
I completed my medical studies at the University of Florida in Gainesville. At the time, there was a one-year program at Florida State before Florida State had a four-year program, and then we joined the second-year students in Gainesville at the University of Florida to complete our medical studies.
Mm-hmm. And you continued on in specialty.
Right. I'm going to have to back up just a moment to say that, my calling to the medical profession, I think, was a way that I felt I could make a difference in promoting the gospel of life. I remember being so moved and inspired by Pope John Paul II's encyclical Evangelium Vitae, the gospel of life. And it was one of these things that everything he wrote, the Holy Spirit had just, confirmed in my heart. And I could have never written it as eloquently as he did, but it resonated as truth. His heart speaks unto heart. And then I discerned that I could really make a difference. God showed me as a physician that I would have the credibility with a medical background to stand up and speak for life. The mentors I had known as Catholic physicians living their faith authentically and bringing it into the ministry that they gave to their patients were mostly family practice doctors. There were several of them that I had been encouraged by. I had met a few of them, and a lot of them had put together a book called Physicians Healed. And it was the story of several physicians, not all Catholics, some Christian, even one Mormon, who had conversions to various degrees, but they all came to recognize that not only was abortion wrong, but contraception as well. That was a part of the problem with abortion, and contraception led to abortion.
We're going to go into that further into our broadcast because it's a slightly separate issue.
Sure.
But let's start off with abortion.
Sure.
Here I am in New York City, the abortion capital of the world, I'm afraid to say.
Yes.
And it's so sad. And give us a physician's view of abortion. What does it do for the woman when this takes place?
Well, when we use the term abortion in the medical profession and as the specialty of obstetrics and gynecology, there are different types of abortion, and you'll hear, abortion is another word for the lay term miscarriage. And, there's something called a spontaneous abortion, a natural miscarriage. You'll even hear the term missed abortion, which means that the child has died, but she has not yet, passed the remains. And then there's this term, that the only proper medical description would be induced abortion, and that's where a physician, by way of medication or a surgical procedure, has caused, the loss of the child, the loss of that life, has caused the death of this, young life. And what it does, it's, from a strictly medical standpoint, it's an intervention by us in the medical profession or outside the medical profession. It's an intervention done on the outside to cause, the death of the child, of the young embryonic life. And I want to take a moment to point out too that, when I talk about, an unborn child or preborn child in the mother's womb, the term frequently used is fetus. In the early stages, we use the term embryo. That the fact that this is a human life is not a religious statement, it's a scientific statement, and my faith only confirms that it's wrong to take innocent life. But, from a purely secular, scientific, and medical biology standpoint, I can recognize that life begins at fertilization. Life begins at conception. So to dismiss that as being a religious teaching, I think, is disingenuous and misleading. And so I just wanted to, make that clarification. And if I can, I want to go back to a little bit about being called to the field of obstetrics and gynecology. At first, that specialty seemed very daunting, that it wouldn't be quite possible as a Catholic physician, especially with the convictions I had regarding contraception as well as in vitro fertilization. I didn't know if it would be possible for me to successfully complete a training program in that field. And
what happened?
Well,
your guardian angel.
A good friend of mine who had given me spiritual direction in the past, his name's Tom Neal, who's a PhD, professor of theology in Des Moines currently. We were having a conversation one time, and I was wrestling with this: should I go into family practice or obstetrics and gynecology? And I was really leaning towards family practice, which is a much broader scope. So it's okay to avoid these sticky issues. You don't have to deal with pregnant women or with women's health problems if you're a family practice doctor, if you don't want to. But I really, the convictions God had put in my heart, really, I was able to see that I needed to go into this field, to study it, to become more knowledgeable, to become an expert in women's health issues. Also, so that I could bring the light of truth, to women, whether they're Catholic, Christian, Protestant, Muslim, or atheist, so that they, could go to a physician that respected them in a full sense.
Now, here we are moving along. Unfortunately, 30 years ago, 35 years ago, abortion became accepted legally in the United States. It was a crime.
Yes.
It went from a crime to a public support.
Right.
Overnight. And it's one of the awful decisions of the Supreme Court of the United States, and it will be a judgment before God on that decision. It was, by the way, it was not elected by the people. It was a decision of the Supreme Court, which is an abuse of legal usage.
Absolutely.
The courts are not supposed to do legislation, but that's an appalling example of a misuse of the court.
Absolutely.
Now, here we are, years later, sad to say, which is predictable psychologically, that people get used to the idea. And even believing people who know that abortion is wrong and speaking against it.
Right.
You kind of learn to live with it.
Right. That's a good point you bring up, because the Roe v. Wade decision was in 1973. Many people in my generation have known nothing else. From the time we were born, it's been legal. So we didn't go through that phase where we saw abortion as a crime in the legal system, and that way, we do become very desensitized to the reality of what is going on. And I firmly believe that abortion today is the human rights issue of our time. It's the civil rights issue of our time. It's the social justice issue of our time. There's no greater cause to be a part of. The horror of what is going on is unthinkable when you realize not only that it happens, but it happens on such a large scale. Right here in New York, statistics came out recently that of all pregnancies, I believe it's 41%, and surgical abortions. Those are the abortions we know about. The number of abortions that are caused by abortifacient medications like the so-called birth control pill, or the intrauterine device, this medical device that's billed as a contraceptive. If we were to try to estimate or calculate the number of abortions caused by that, we'd probably have to at least double or triple the number of surgical abortions to get a true estimate. And we're on the order of 40 million already without taking that into account.
When we come back for our break, Doctor, I'm going to ask you, for our audience, to go into the question of contraception as related to abortion, especially the uterine, what do you call it?
In vitro fertilization, or the intrauterine device.
Intrauterine device.
Right.
These are not things that are not a part of my life at all. But,
be thankful.
But you tell me that they cause an abortion.
Indeed.
So we're going to come back to that in a couple of minutes. Okay. Well, welcome you this evening again to our program, and we're having a fascinating program on life and death.
Yes.
So, Doctor, if you could, Dr. Cudihy, go on with what you were talking to us about these devices that are actually causing an abortion.
Well, yeah, unfortunately, a lot of women are never made aware of the fact that many things promoted to them and suggested to them by their physicians not only are contraceptives, but many times act as abortifacients, meaning they actually can cause an abortion, one of these induced abortions I spoke about earlier. And the worst of these is something called the intrauterine device. The intrauterine device has a very ugly history. Shortly after these were promoted in mass production in the United States, a lot of women had severe infections where they were frequently hospitalized with sepsis that would cause infections in the uterus. Because this thing, it's a foreign body, and when a foreign body is put into someone's an internal organ, it becomes a nidus for infection. You know, they've improved on that, so the risk of infection is not as great. And so they've worked hard to try to promote an acceptance of this device again. But this device has always been understood, you know, to have a couple of mechanisms of action. One of the ways it does act is probably as a contraceptive, because it can prevent conception from occurring. It can alter the lining of the uterus and create what's called an inflammatory state so that the sperm may not survive in order for conception to occur. However, this inflammatory environment, this hostile environment within the uterine cavity where the developing embryo would be able to grow, also is a place that is likely to cause an abortion. So conception, which typically happens in the fallopian tube where the life starts, the small embryo is not able to implant and survive because of this device and what's happened. And it is very difficult to know how often this happens because it's such an early pregnancy, such an early life that it's difficult to detect. And a woman probably would not even know, you know, when this has happened. And I think something similar, what we know, you know, again, according to the mechanisms of action with the birth control pill, that there are two ways it probably acts as a contraceptive agent by preventing fertilization from occurring, either by making it difficult for the sperm to meet the egg or by suppressing the release of the egg. But when those things don't work, it also has that added effect of preventing implantation or not allowing implantation to remain where the embryo is able to survive. And when, you know, either friends of mine, you know, or other women, in particular when patients of mine find out about this, you know, they are rightfully upset that they weren't told this. You know, there is a principle that's held in high esteem in the secular medical profession of informed consent. And unfortunately, very few women are ever given informed consent when they are given these pills or devices, you know, in their bodies.
In our discussion earlier, Doctor, we've talked about a certain kind of corruption coming into the medical profession. Now, in the United States, we've always held the medical profession in high esteem.
Right.
And a man who has a medical degree is referred to as doctor. You wouldn't hardly ever call a physician Mr. Unless you lived in England and he was a surgeon. Right. Surgeons are called Mr. for some reason.
Interesting.
But which means master in that case.
Okay.
But it's a very respected profession, and it deserves to be. Right. Wonderful. But here we have a dark, dark cloud over the profession.
Yeah, I think that, a real revolution, in the medical profession was when Hippocrates saw the corruption in his time, the time before Christ, that physicians were not only acting to promote and preserve life, but they were, and at times, becoming agents of death. That physicians, if they were bribed or paid more by someone else, would sometimes give a remedy, billed as a remedy that actually caused harm and even death to the patients that went to them for help. So, Hippocrates developed a new standard, a code of ethics that we have come to know as the Hippocratic Oath. Now, what I find interesting is that most people today, believe that physicians still take the Hippocratic Oath. But, for many years, that has not been the case. I graduated from medical school in 2003, and, several years before that, the Hippocratic Oath had already been thrown out. And what we and most medical schools, I presume, have done in place is at some point in our first year or two of medical school, we all kind of get together in circles and try to come up with ideas that we can all agree upon. And unfortunately, these become a lot of meaningless platitudes. We will, try to be good, we will promote diversity, and we won't judge other people. Things that don't have the same requirement, that a solemn oath as the Hippocrates Oath did. And part of that, there's probably a certain sense of honesty that physicians recognize that with the widespread promotion of abortion, they could no longer say, honestly that they were going to uphold some of those principles of the Hippocratic Oath.
Now, would you say in the United States right now, the number of abortions is very large, but there's a growing sense, not just within the Catholic Church, but this, interestingly, public opinion against abortion. There was a recent study of 51 or 52% of people basically rejecting the idea of abortion.
Yes, and I think that we're seeing, in our lifetime, the new springtime in the church and in the faith, and one of its manifestations is in, pro-life work, and I've always been encouraged at the March for Life in D.C. every year on the sorrowful anniversary of Roe v. Wade. The majority of people there are young people. They're
Yes.
from high schools, and college. That makes up the vast majority of those who are willing to make the long trip. We used to do it from Tallahassee, Florida, a bus trip up to D.C., an all-night drive. And we were glad to do it because we knew it was for a cause greater than ourselves.
They pushed me along in my wheelchair. If it's warm enough, it's a cold day, I don't go. But isn't it amazing that there you are in Washington, D.C., and this huge crowd of people protesting abortion, and they don't put it in the paper.
It is.
They lie.
Right.
The media lies.
I'll never forget, the day after the first time I went to the march, I was amazed by the tens, probably hundreds of thousands of people there at the march, and I wanted to see in the USA Today, what they had about it. And they found the 7 or 8 pro-abortion demonstrators there and put them on the front page, and they had a small little caption, where they, really took the picture in such a way to make it look like there was a smaller group than there really was.
I haven't read the USA Today since that day. I'm fed up with them.
Yes.
They're phonies. But much of the media, the New York Times, is pro-abortion all over the place.
Unfortunately, it seems that the mainstream media does not really represent the heart of many young people today and the soul of the country. I mean, I think that there's a certain sense of elitism that a lot of us who become a part of the media feel that we need to promote a value that other people should ascribe to.
Well, I'm delighting that the young people are doing it. As I'm getting ready to leave, take off and get back to the other world, I'm delighted by young adults and older teenagers in this country, obviously, generally, moving toward more value-oriented, if I may say, more orthodox, more serious
Absolutely.
study. Where does it come from? Nobody knows. I can only blame the Holy Spirit.
Yes.
Because it didn't come from anybody else.
And I want to say, too, as far as the young people, I've seen the same thing in the medical professional. You know, when I was going through OB/GYN residency, there weren't many people who had tried to do this as I did, being, you know, with my, you know, my recognition of the horror of abortion, but also of contraception. Going through this sort of training without participating in contraception, sterilization, in vitro fertilization. There were a few physicians I talked to, but a lot of them had had conversions after the fact or had different routes they arrived at it. But since then, there are many medical students that have contacted me, you know, those in college considering medical school that have asked me about it. And I believe that there's not only a new generation of wonderful priests, which I know there are, and many that I've been blessed to know, but also of physicians. And, you know, I'll get a little back to that story, you know, of my journey through specialty training, if you like.
Obliquely, in my broadcasts, I've made an appeal to other clergy, Protestant, Jewish clergy, to be outspoken for life.
Yes.
I think that needs to be done.
Yes.
And like any other segment of the society, we members of the clergy, we can be deceived ourselves.
Right.
In the history of the Catholic Church, the clergy have been deceived in the past, and I would not like to see that today.
You bring up a good point about being deceived, because it's not only, you know, the lay faithful at Mass that can be deceived, you know, the laity or the patients of ours, but physicians also are deceived. And I, you know, I can't pass judgment on the hearts of any physicians who are participating in the prescribing of birth control and these various other things. Even though they may be abortifacients, many physicians aren't aware that this is the case, and they themselves are deceived. And one of the other things, you know, that I have come to learn with my study of this issue is, you know, genuine medical harms caused to women by the birth control pill. And I can talk a little bit more about that.
Yes.
There are, you know, two issues that come up quite frequently when I have patients of mine that are been put on the pill. They've been taking it for several years by another physician. And one of them is the association with breast cancer. There's a friend of mine who's done a lot of wonderful research on this by the name of, his name is Dr. Chris Callenborn. He interestingly happens to work at the same hospital as me, but he's published things, you know, on widely respected peer-reviewed journals on this. And looking at a meta-analysis, combining multiple studies, looking at data of thousands of women over a long span of time, we've been able to see that as much as 40 to 44% of an increased risk of breast cancer. So of women who've been on the pill. Now, this is for women who have not had a full-term pregnancy yet, which accounts for, you know, a large percentage of these young women. And the type of breast cancer that this predisposes them to is premenopausal breast cancer, the worst type. And I'll just, you know, make a plug for there's a website that you can actually find the full text of this particular study. It's www.polycarp.org.
Polycarp,
POLYCARP.org, and you can reference on that website. You can get the studies, and he also recently put up for me another study with the connection with cervical cancer and the birth control pill, and the risk there among women who are HPV positive, which, you know, we presume that a large majority of women are. Unfortunately, the risk of cervical cancer increases by more than 200%. You know, after being on the pill for 5 years, over 400% increased risk by about 10 years. And these are issues that women are not made aware of. They're frequently told that the pill will decrease their risk of ovarian cancer, which to a certain degree is true, but they're not told that it increases the risk of breast cancer, which, since breast cancer is so much more common, is a much greater threat to their health. So purely from a medical standpoint, this isn't good medicine.
But it's all over the place.
Yes.
All over the place.
Yes.
That's a general kind of an assumption.
Right.
And you hear it all over the place. Yes.
And I've asked myself, why is this that, you know, doctors tend to look the other way in the face of such evidence? And there's two things. You know, I think that they aren't willing to ask the question if they don't want to know the answer. But this concern of conception, or being this idea of conception as being a disease, of the world being overpopulated, that we need to promote contraception and reduce population, that tends to be placed at a higher priority than women's health. Even the National Organization of Women's Health, groups that proclaim to be concerned about women's health, their concern about women's dignity and women's rights are actually subjugated under this ideal of population control and the promotion, the so-called right of reproductive rights, to include abortion as well as contraception and sterilization.
Now we're going to have a break, and I'm going to come on to a sensitive subject that is very close to my heart, and that's the African American question here.
Yes.
And all my life, since I was 14 years old, I was concerned about civil rights. They didn't even have a name, and I had friends who were African American, and I saw the terrible injustice and prejudice was there. And I knew Martin Luther King. I went to jail, and we're going to talk about that because that's a big issue. Be back in a couple of minutes. Before we get right now back to Dr. Cudihy, I want to ask you to be sure to write me down, send me a message for Sunday Night Prime. I'm going to have one whole evening coming up with Father John Lynch, just doing emails. So Sunday Night Prime at EWTN.com. Sunday Night Prime, one word, at EWTN.com. Let's hear from you, okay? Now, Doctor, we're back there on a very important issue right there, and that was the relationship of the people pushing abortion on the African American community. Now, as I told you, when I was 14 years old, somehow or other, I became very aware of how the African American kids and people were pushed around. Where I lived in the North, it was not open segregation, but it was very subtle.
Sure.
And I went out of my way. One of my classmates was the first black Sister of Charity in her congregation. And we had, and all my life, I have been involved with the African American people and the civil rights and off to jail, a whole bit.
Right.
And I would be so aware that Planned Parenthood has really located itself strategically in the African American and the Hispanic American areas. And the founder, Margaret Sanger, explicitly wanted to pull out the weeds. I mean, she was a pure
racist,
pure. And let's face that issue. And I think it's still going on.
I agree. That's something else that really, it shouldn't have surprised me, but it did. It really left an impression on me when I saw the statistics that African American women were more than twice as likely to have an abortion. And of the patients I've had over the years, there's been a large disproportion as far as the patients of mine that have had abortions and those who don't. And if anything, I've seen it much more exaggerated that the vast majority of the women I've cared for that have had abortions were African American women. And as you said, the founder of Planned Parenthood, who still is venerated and honored by that organization, she was very much a racist, and she saw that people of African descent as an inferior race, that needed to be, weeded out, so to speak, in a manner.
And a lot of other people, too.
Exactly.
The Jews.
Yes.
The Catholics.
Yes.
This lady, I have to say, was very consistent.
Yes, she was. And she was, a eugenist,
Yes.
and a eugenicist, which is still alive with us today, which I can talk to a little bit later. But in finishing my OBGYN training in the inner city, Buffalo, New York, I was really saddened to see, the number of African American women we cared for that had several abortions before coming to us when they would have their first child, or if it was their second child, they had several abortions as well. And the way that Planned Parenthood has promoted not only abortion, but contraception and sterilization and this very undignified way among this community, it really struck me. And I began to see for the first time that Planned Parenthood, probably more than any other organization, is responsible for promoting the cycle of poverty among the African American community, particularly in the inner city.
Now, when we're out on Saturday morning,
right,
some of the friars and sisters in front of the abortion place, there will be the older middle-aged women who will represent Planned Parenthood. And they're nice old ladies. I talk to them, And one day the clinic was closed, and we stood there talking for a while. They are deceived.
Indeed.
They're not bad people.
Right.
They are deceived people.
Right.
And, and the Bible calls Satan the deceiver.
Father of lies. Yes.
Father of lies.
Yes.
Satan, father of lies. It's so terribly sad.
Yes, and I've known a lot of, good people in the medical profession that, with all sincerity, believe that they are doing a good thing by, prescribing contraception, sterilizing, and even doing abortions. They believe that somehow, and many people in Planned Parenthood think that by, going to the African American community, they are going to somehow liberate them and free them. But there's a deception there, and that's what's sad, is that people oftentimes mean good when in fact they're causing harm. And I saw that in my training as well. And if you'd like, I'd like to go back to that.
Yes, please, Doctor.
So, earlier on, and this is something I, think your audience may be particularly interested in hearing, is my story. So how does, a young Catholic, freshly graduated physician go about training? And I was accepted at a military OBGYN training in Texas. And they knew my philosophical beliefs, and at least on the onset, were willing to accommodate that. I think initially they saw it as a religious observance that they, couldn't, impose, that they had to respect, that they could not discriminate me against, for having that. At least a 51% majority felt that way, and so I was accepted into this program. However, from the very beginning, I was under the microscope. There was a lot of hostility towards me. And not because I spoke about this, I was very silent. I almost never spoke to any of my colleagues or faculty about that. But in my silence, because I wasn't promoting and endorsing contraception, especially among my patients, because I wasn't going to be recommending abortion either, or in any way, facilitating that, or participating in other type procedures, as, for example, sterilizations. And then when, I also declined to participate in the IVF program, which was very big, that created more and more hostility towards me. And eventually that, grew to the point where, about halfway through my third year of a 4-year program, things came to a head, and there was efforts to try to force me out. And, part under false pretenses, false accusations that I had, removed an IUD, of all things, this abortifacient device I spoke about, without a patient's permission, which was preposterous, but it gave them something to try to hang me on, in a sense. And so I was faced with a decision to, either try to make some accommodation so that they would accept me, and then I saw really I couldn't do that, and I couldn't, in good conscience, do anything differently in trying to facilitate, the promotion of the culture of death, really. I couldn't, participate in the sterilization, contraception programs and the IVF. And so then it was a question of whether or not I was going to pursue a federal lawsuit against the Army, or this program in particular, for discrimination, or if I would just resign and walk away. And very timely, I was reading a biography of St. Thomas More at the time. And I was, it seemed that my experience was paralleling what St. Thomas More is going through, where he came to a point where he could no longer, in good conscience, continue to serve the king. And I think that's the point I came to. And so, with a lot of prayer and counsel from trusted, friends and advisors, I decided to resign. And I only hoped, that I wouldn't suffer the same fate of being put in prison and beheaded. But there's something interesting along those lines that came up later. But as I was making this decision, there was a sad moment one evening. My wife and I, we had 2 children at this time, one, a newborn, and the other about, almost 3 years old. And I saw my children there, and I realized that if I left this program, if I resigned, I was very likely going to be separated from my family for some time. I was in the Army, and if I left the training program, I knew that I was very likely going to be sent to Iraq, and that I would miss, time with my wife, but particularly those precious months of childhood with my children. And it really hurt, my soul, knowing that that was, a sacrifice that I was going to have to make, that only for, trying to do the right thing and not being willing to participate in something I knew was harming women, which is something that I think really disturbed my colleagues, the faculty, my fellow classmates, you could say. It was their conscience must have been disturbed more than mine, because as long as it was a religious observation, it wasn't a problem. People frequently say, well, Damon, that's great, that the devout Catholic woman can come to you and that they share your beliefs. But it wasn't about just taking care of Catholic women, because when things are true, they're universal. They apply to all things, to all people, all places, and all times. So if it was wrong for me to sterilize, one of my Catholic patients, it was equally as wrong for me to sterilize one of my Muslim patients, or, Protestant, or any others. And so, and the fact that I, was thoroughly convinced of this through and through is more than just religious observation. I think that really disturbed some of my colleagues and faculty.
Where do you, at the present time, with the whole situation?
Well, I'll have to backtrack a little bit. So I did resign. I still had a military obligation, a 2-year commitment as a general medical officer that I was then going to serve. I was transferred to a military base, to an Army base in Alabama, and then not long after that I was sent to Iraq for about a 13-month tour in Iraq, and I was working as a field surgeon, basically what used to be called a general medical officer. And that was, probably the toughest year of my life, and definitely for my family. The separation, being apart from my wife and children, was very difficult. And while I was there, I arrived there not long, after some American soldiers were actually beheaded tragically. And at one point, I was actually at the same compound, that the American, Army had actually taken over again, where the American soldiers were beheaded. And they showed me this cage where these American servicemen were. And it reminded me, just of the danger I was in, knowing that, I was surrounded, in that area by a lot of people that wanted to kill me as well as the other American soldiers I was working with. And it brought, that situation with St. Thomas More, that here, after resigning because I couldn't violate my conscience, because God gave me the grace to, in that sense, that I ended up in a situation where I could have as easily been captured and beheaded like the others. Which, I want to back up again too, going back to Humanae Vitae by Pope Paul VI, a prophetic pope, who wrote about the connection or the harm and the evil of contraception. After reading this in prayer and reading other, similar writings about this, I became so convinced of this truth, which was complete contradiction to what society had been proclaiming about contraception. I was so convinced that the church had it right. I remember telling a friend of mine, after Mass one day, that I would be willing to die, standing up for that truth. And I almost kind of chuckled after that, thinking, I can't imagine in today's day and age that someone could ever die because they didn't believe in contraception, that they might be killed for it. But a few years later, here I was in Iraq being shot at times, all which you could follow, all because, earlier on I refused to participate in contraception and promote it. So I didn't expect I would have the opportunity to put my life on the line, but I did.
Well, observing this as 50 years as a priest, I realize that a great many people having difficulties with management, the number of children, and
Yes.
Family control, don't see contraception particularly bad.
Right.
And it's nowhere near abortion. I mean,
Right.
it's
Certainly.
totally different thing. And so what you have to do if you're a confessor, you encourage people to do the best they can by abstention, abstinence.
Right.
And sometimes, particularly younger people who've gone to a not very good Catholic college,
Right.
they're looking at you. What are you saying? I mean, where did you get off with Columbus,
Right.
And unfortunately, this is something of a failure of the clergy. We don't preach this. Now, on Sunday morning, you can't get up and give a sermon on contraception, And there was an old Capuchin friar, Father Innocent, and he used to preach against contraception at the old ladies' home, The youngest lady there was 73. But it is to be discussed,
Yes.
explained, examined, and it should be brought into the discussion.
Yep.
And I would encourage priests to do this.
Yes.
And come out gently.
Yes.
Gently. In good psychology, if you're trying to convince something positively, you give them a tough push.
Yes.
You make them more. But if you're going to change the valence, the value from positive to negative or negative to positive, it's a gentle one to do it.
And I should say, too, when I speak to my patients about it, when they, ask me about this, I don't need, to appeal to magisterial teaching, to Pope's, writings. The truth is in the heart. My young children, my 6-year-old, my 8-year-old, and, they can understand that there's something inherently wrong about a doctor giving a medication, a poison, to prevent a woman from conceiving, from being able to have a child. And so it's not that complicated. We have to be sort of indoctrinated and programmed to believe that fertility is a disease, to be avoided.
There's the point.
Yes, and that when patients see that, when I tell them the reason I can't sterilize you is because I believe that your fertility is a healthy condition, that if you can conceive, that's a good thing. And the same with these medications, that not only do they violate your human dignity, or are they an insult to your body, in a philosophical sense, but they even do harm medically. I made reference to those issues of increased risk of cancer, but that's just part of it. There's a deep psychological wound done to the woman when we treat her fertility as if it's a disease that needs to be stamped out. And I just want to point out, too, that I was sharing with you earlier this morning that there is a professor of obstetrics that told me once in the classroom setting that the greatest preventative medicine of the modern times was contraception. And you follow the logic of that. If preventative medicine is contraception, that means conception, life is a disease. And if life is a disease, we not only treat disease by preventing it, we treat it after it's occurred. So the logic of thinking of contraception as a preventive medicine supports abortion as the curative medicine if the prevention didn't work. So, we see there's a very consistent connection between contraception and abortion. But I agree, we do need to be gentle and careful about how we address this, because many people just don't know, and they haven't been told.
And the idea of life. Our Lord says, I am the way,
Yes.
the truth, and the life. And we should rejoice in life.
Yes.
Unfortunately, in the Western civilization right now, and we see European countries actually disappearing.
Yes.
The French, the Italians, the English, they're disappearing.
Yes.
Because they don't believe in life.
Sad.
Doctor, thank you so much.
Thank you.
I appreciate you
an
being
honor.
here. Oh Lord, in your goodness and mercy, look upon us and send the Holy Spirit upon us, that we may believe in life, that we may protect life, and that we may believe that Christ alone is ultimately the Word, the truth, and the life. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. And, of course, I want you to help EWTN going, and I'm hoping in a few weeks to get down to see Mother Angelica, and she'll be asking me quietly, are you keeping EWTN on? So, please. And I'm so grateful that non-Catholics support this program, the whole works, to come up and tell me how much they enjoy it. So let's stick together. God bless you, and see you next week.